Good morning, I'm Ed Pozzuoli, President of Tripp Scott, and today we're honored to have the Chief Strategist for the Republican National Committee, Sean Spicer. Sean, welcome to Tripp Scott.
Thanks, Ed.
And this week you have some meetings scheduled for South Florida. What's the purpose of the meetings down in Hollywood?
The RNC meets 3 times a year in various places around the country to conduct the business of the party. And this is our last meeting before we head to Cleveland. We do things like update our budget, discuss our ground game, provide the members with updates in key areas of the RNC.
Obviously, there's a lot more focus on this RNC
Yes.
meeting than previous, right?
That's right.
And some of that has to do with the potential of a contested election come Cleveland. And there's a lot of, how would I say, misunderstanding and confusion about that process.
Right.
What would you, to clarify some of the process for our viewers, share with us a little overview of how the primary process leads into the convention process?
Let me back it up one step even further. The role of the Republican National Committee is to be the sort of the process person, the arbiter of the process. What we do is make sure that the rules that the delegates have selected are followed, the procedures are followed, et cetera, and have an open and transparent process. So what we have right now is 50 states and 6 territories in the District of Columbia having primaries, caucuses, and conventions to select and allocate the delegates of each state. When you get 1,237 bound delegates, you become the nominee of our party. That's been the case since 1976. We haven't had an open convention. That was the last time that we had one. And what that means is if you go around the country and go to these different contests, last night New York had 95 delegates up for grabs. And as each one gets allocated, if you hit that magic number of 1,237, you become the presumptive nominee, no ifs, ands, or buts. But if someone doesn't hit that number, we go to what we call an open convention. Now, there's 2 issues at stake. Number one, what we call bound versus unbound delegates.
Right, on the delegate side.
And what happens is, in each state and territory, the local grassroots organization determines how they're going to allocate and select their delegates. Frankly, for all the hubbub about it, because I get it is complex, but it's grassroots driven. It's not Washington top down. It's bottom up. It's each state and territory. It's Iowa saying that we'd rather have a caucus, or Kentucky saying that we used to have a primary, we'd like to have a caucus now, or Virginia moving from a convention to a primary. But all of those decisions are made at the local level by grassroots voters.
So as an example, whether or not how delegates are selected, as an example, is left to the states and local.
Every state determines 3 things. So they get an allocation of delegates.
Right.
So
like Florida is 99.
Florida's 99. So there's a formula that determines that. You get 3 per congressional district. Right. You get 10 to start off with. And then what happens is there's a formula that be based on how Republican your state is in terms of elected officials and road.
So
you
Florida
get the allocation. Florida gets
99. Right.
What Florida decided is to allocate them all winner take all. Whoever gets the most number of votes gets all 99 of those. That was a Florida decision. So what happened is Donald Trump came in. He got 55% of the vote. He got all of the delegates. You get a state like Iowa, and they issue them proportionally. And again, how they issue them is up to that state to determine. And so what happens is, and then the more complex issue is you determine whether those delegates are bound or unbound.
So explain that to our viewers what that means.
Right, and that's a very important distinction. So in Florida, what Florida local Republicans decided is that if you get elected in Florida, if you come in and win the vote, not only do you get all of the delegates, but they are bound to you for the first 3 ballots.
Right.
Some states like North Dakota say we're not going to bind our delegates. You are voting for individuals to run as delegates, and then they determine how they're going to vote. And sometimes that's because a candidate has made the most persuasive case. Sometimes they want to follow the will of the preference vote in their state. But it's up to those individuals, and it's almost like any other elected official. They get elected, and then they get to decide how they're going to vote on key issues.
So the winner-take-all or proportional, as an example, is left to a state. When they're bound and when they're unbound is left to the state. What's the third?
Well, the third piece is how the selection occurs. In other words, in a state like New Hampshire, each candidate submits a slate of delegates and says, okay, we have 25 delegates at stake. Here are the 25 individuals that if I win those delegates that I want, I'm going to rank order them 1 through 25. In other states, Virginia, where I live, they say you go run for those slots and then we'll tell you how you're bound. In Florida, it's partially by congressional district. But again, each state determines the selection process for who fills that slot as well.
Okay, so all those are state-driven, local-driven,
Right.
and not RNC.
We literally say to each one of them, you need to submit a plan by October 1st of the year before the election and tell us how you're going to do it. And remember, the interesting thing about the rules of the RNC is that those rules, the rules that we follow, are driven by the rules that the delegates of the last convention pass. And so as we head into this convention in Cleveland, which is going to be a really historic convention, I think. There's a lot of things. The thing that gets the most attention is the nomination of president and vice president. But they also do two other things that are really important. Number one is they pass a platform for the party. Number two is they pass the rules by which this party will live by for the next 4 years. And that's important. So the rules that we live by, what we have told the states, this is the deadline to submit, your allocation and selection of delegate process, was determined by the delegates of the last convention.
And so the question, a lot of confusion around, do the rules have an opportunity on the RNC side? Do they have an opportunity to change before Cleveland?
That's a really good question. Because there's a lot of hubbub there's two really distinct issues here. The RNC, the Republican National Committee, has 168 members, each 3 from every state and territory. There's a rules committee on there. There's also a rules committee at the convention made up of delegates. The RNC Rules Committee generally makes recommendations to the convention and says, we believe that you should update the rules in the following way. And they're simply recommendations. This week, when this rules committee meets, the chairman of the committee, Reince Priebus, has argued that the delegates should that the members of the RNC should make no recommendations, because with the added scrutiny, he believes that we don't need to add that layer of questionability on whether or not we're doing something or recommending something that may or may not benefit a particular candidate.
That's part of what the discussion is going to be down on Holiday.
That's right,
next
and they're
couple
going to.
days.
And so the chairman's view is, since all we can do is make recommendations at this point, what we should do is defer all decisions to the delegates who have been elected by grassroots Republican voters.
So now let's zoom ahead. There'll be a rules committee that'll be seated for purpose of the convention.
That's right.
So what the chairman now wants is kind of no rules recommendations coming out of this meeting in Hollywood. Now zoom ahead to the rules committee for the convention.
To further complicate matters,
Right.
2 individuals from every state, 1 man, 1 woman, a total of 112, because you've got 6 territories in the District of Columbia, who will gather in Cleveland. Those individuals will determine the rules for the next 4 years of the Republican Party. So they will debate, every aspect of what we need to do as a party for the next 4 years. And they will send those recommendations to the floor of the convention, where all of the delegates must vote and accept those rules changes that will occur for the next 4 years.
So one of the more controversial rules coming out of the last convention was Rule 40B.
That's right.
Which talked about in order to win the nomination, you had to win 8 states by majority during the primary process. Today, that rule does exist.
Right.
And that can be subject to discussion or
Absolutely.
change when the rules committee gets together in Cleveland.
Sure. Remember, in 2012, the delegates that went to that convention were almost entirely Romney delegates.
Right.
So they wrote rules that were favorable to Mitt Romney, and they frankly were intended to keep Ron Paul off, from being nominated. So the question for this convention, that will largely be made up of Cruz and Trump delegates, is what's the rule that they want? Now, maybe they maintain the same rule, maybe they change it, maybe they don't, but it'll be up to them to decide what's in their best interest.
And of course, the level of scrutiny in Cleveland might be greater.
I have a feeling it will be. Absolutely.
All right. So now we get to the convention, and talk a little bit about the way the process inside the convention works, the balloting and
So there's four committees that must meet. We
Right.
talked about rules. There's platform, credentials, and permanent organization. Those 4 will present their reports. And the key to everything that occurs at the convention is 2 things. Number 1, you have to have a majority on everything. So a majority of the will of the elected delegates is what's going to determine the outcome of every aspect of this convention. Number 2, it's all going to be done in the open. So every single thing that's going to happen is frankly going to be an awesome exercise in democracy. And I think that's going to be really important for people to see, because since 1976, it's always been basically a television show where we've had 4 nights of programming. People just watch a couple speeches. Now you're actually going to see the business of a party get done.
But none of those issues, like as an example, credentialing is an important committee because it actually approves the seating of all the delegates
That's
that
right.
have been elected by the states.
Right.
So there might be a challenge or 2 potentially
That's
from
right.
a campaign.
But you know what's really interesting, Ed, is
Sure.
that the process that we follow, for anybody who's out there that's involved in an organization that uses a convention, so sometimes an HOA uses that or a Kiwanis Club, we literally follow the same process. So as you pointed out, you can't start a convention. You have a temporary role without the credentials committee offering up the temporary role and asking those delegates to vote on the temporary role to make it a permanent role.
Right.
So, because you can't have an organization, whether it's a law firm or a Kiwanis Club or an HOA, where you must first agree who is a voting member of that organization.
Right. So all of these processes, whether it was convention or credentialing or rules, most of that was done kind of not behind the scenes. It was all done in the open previously, but never got the kind of attention that we're looking forward to.
There was never any interest in coming the week before from news organizations or outside interest to watch it. Suddenly now everybody wants to come to Cleveland a week before.
Right.
I think the Cleveland Economic Bureau is really excited about it.
Because of the extra
That's
days,
right.
extra hotel days, right. Talk a little bit about how the balloting works then.
Well, we're entering into some uncharted territories. That's part of the process that we'll go through for permanent organization. They'll set some of that up.
Right.
And again, it will have to be passed by the majority of delegates.
Right.
But I expect we'll start a roll call vote. We'll go through the reports. Those will all either ultimately have to be passed by a majority of delegates. And then we'll start the nomination process. And whichever candidate gets to 1237 will become the nominee. And so, whether that's on the first ballot, the second ballot, or in the case of 1903, I think we won 105 ballots.
Well, let's not hope for that.
That's right.
But the question becomes to people who are watching this really for the first time. Not that it didn't happen before. We've seen it in '76 with.
But again, in '76, it was one ballot. It wasn't
It
until
was one
1948
ballot,
that we had subsequent ballots.
We did go into
That's right.
the convention in an open way, because the nomination wasn't yet won by President Ford over Ronald Reagan then. But ultimately, there was whatever happened, and we ended up with the first ballot nominating President Ford. But if we go into an open convention like this, how ultimately this bound-unbound becomes real important.
That's right.
And so Florida delegates are locked in for
ballots.
the first three ballots. But there are other states, say like as an example, North Carolina. North Carolina is an interesting case. They have 72 ballots, 72 delegates. But they also have a handful of delegates, as an example, that are allocated to Marco Rubio. So the last point I want to mention is what happens to the suspended campaigns that have earned delegates?
And that's a great question, because it depends. And again, it's a state issue. So every state has to determine whether a candidate is actively seeking the presidency or not. That's up to that state to determine, because what happens, and this gets back to that idea of the credentials report, is the state submits to the RNC a list of delegates that have been selected and how that state is binding and allocating their delegates.
Right.
So if a state rules that they believe that Marco Rubio or any other candidate is still an active
no
president,
longer seeking, right.
or no longer seeking it, then they become unbound if they don't believe that an individual is still seeking the presidency or actively campaigning. And again, it depends on how their rules are written in their particular state.
So let's just take Marco's 170-something delegates that he won. There could be a portion of them that are unbound as early as the first ballot.
Right.
There could be a portion of them that are unbound after the first ballot, and so on. So,
that's correct. So the first ballot, you've got somewhere in the area of 95, 96, 97% that are bound. They must vote for the individual that their state has told them, no matter what. The secretary will only record the ballot as the state has allocated that individual is selected to fill that spot. So it doesn't matter if they stand on the floor and yell out another candidate's name. The secretary, by rule of the last convention, must record their name the way that the state allocated it. If they are unbound, they can do whatever they want. And so as we get into the second round of balloting, it drops down to about 60-something%.
So you'll see more delegates making up their own mind.
And then by the third round, only Florida is actually bound on the third round of balloting.
All right. So there has been criticism around the nomination process because it's quote unquote undemocratic. Now we don't have super delegates in the sheer mass of the Democratic Party, because we've seen that. Any comment on the Democratic side?
Well, I mean, again, I think to your point, if you look at every one of these processes, it's grassroots driven in each one of the 50 states and 6 territories in the District of Columbia, how they want to do it. It's out in the open for everybody to see. At the end of the day, we're an organization driven by our membership, like any other organization. And so while it may be unfamiliar to folks, it is very democratic. The process was frankly chosen and voted on by the activists in that state or county or congressional district. The Democratic Party has 1/5 of their delegates that are quote super delegates, unelected party bosses. They get to come and be involved in the process. That was instituted in the 1980s because the Democrats were actually afraid that their elected delegates might make the wrong decision.
So they sort of have a star chamber
Right.
scenario. In fact, that really accounts for most of the difference between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders.
That's right.
Now.
When you actually look at her lead is largely driven by that superdelegate.
Right. And so with that, I'm going to bring to a close. I want to thank you for your work on the RNC, and thanks for spending the time with us this
Thank you
morning.
for having me.